Hello and welcome to Introduction to Diversity, Week 1. The purpose of this lecture is to begin examining forms of inequality and social stratification and the diverse experiences of different racial and ethnic groups in the United States. This class is heavily centered on a sociological perspective, meaning we're looking at the institutions that structure our life, such as the education system and the family and culture and the economics, things along those lines. And then we're also looking at, again, aspects of stratification, the ways we divide into groups, and social inequality. So it's a very interesting class. Some of the things you might hear in this class are unique. When I first started learning about diversity, it just made me kind of question a lot of things about race and ethnicity, and I'm hoping you guys have a similar experience. Again, the only disclaimer with this class is a lot of it's tough subjects, and a lot of it's new subjects, and thinking about race and ethnicity in ways that you might never have thought of. Even questioning what race you are, for example, or do you even belong to a race? Things like that are part of this class, and that's just part of the experience of learning about race and ethnicity and what it means to say race is a social construction, for example, that there's no biological basis. So we're going to be exploring some pretty diverse and tough topics. A lot of it's happy and positive, looking at multiculturalism and group interaction, but then a lot of it's very dark and tough. Because when we look at the history of racial interactions and ethnic interactions, some of it's great, and then a lot of it is very dark and sad. Okay? All right. So, the first part of this really talks about how are we placed into groups? How is it that we come to identify as, a race or an ethnic group? How does that socialization process begin? How long have races been around? How long have different ethnic groups and different religions been around? What is the origin of race? Is a question that I'm always going to be asking in this class, because I want you to start to see that, maybe race didn't exist as we think about it 500 years ago, and it's a relatively new construct. Even though we all seemingly identify with racial categories, this is identifying with brand new categories that have not universal across the world and have not been around for a very long time. Historically, the interactions about race relations, we know the history of slavery. We know the experiences of Asian Americans coming over and having their citizenships revoked. So we're going to be talking about a lot of that, the history of race and racism and racial interactions. But just to open it up, the idea in modern times is racism is rarely tolerated. Again, historically, it was much more overt, and in modern times in the United States, it's much more unacceptable. But just because things are better doesn't mean things are totally perfect. It's like the gender gap between males and females. Yes, women's rights have increased a lot, but yet there's still that gender gap in pay, for example, okay? So there remain these challenges for immigrants and people of minority status, women, people that are non-white, people of religious minorities, and people of different sexual orientations. They still are susceptible to prejudice and discrimination, okay? So in the United States currently, if you look at the racial demography, white will no longer have a majority racial status coming up in the future. Currently, it's 58.7% white, around 12% black, 8% or about 1% Native American, 7% Asian, 6% Arab, and two or more races, which is a new category which we'll be critiquing a little bit in this class. Again, 3.1%, okay? But in 2011, Latino babies outnumbered white babies for the first time ever. So you're beginning to see this trend where this idea of white having a majority when it comes to population, there might be a big change there. Okay, but that's a big factor because historically in the United States, for example, the people that had the most access to life chances, the people that had the ability to rise up the social class ladder, were males of European descent. So arguably all non-males of European descent are minority groups. And this idea of a minority group is these are people who have less power or less control over their lives. And it's not just when it comes to like race and sex. It's also sexual orientation, things like that. Who has more power over their lives? Who experiences more prejudice and discrimination? Someone that identifies as straight or someone that identifies as non-straight, for example. Okay? So in the United States, minorities have been subjugated into the lower classes by European descendants of the male gender. And this has gone on for centuries. Again, when you had the middle class revolution of George Washington overthrowing the British, when they took over the country, they had the opportunity to give rights to women and non-Europeans, people of European descent that identified as white, which probably wasn't necessarily a thing at that time. It is nowadays. That's my hesitancy to call George Washington white, because they even used those words back then. It's going to be some of you guys are going to be thinking about. But George Washington had their chance to give, rights to minorities, and they denied them access. They denied them to life chances. Okay. So this idea of putting and subjugating someone into the lower classes is this idea of reducing their life chances. And life chances are all about access to education and good job, prestige, and wealth, and power. Okay, and what group you belong to dictates where in the social class system you are, and it also dictates your life chances. Therefore, the people with the lowest life chances, arguably in America right now, are Latino females, because Latina females only make 60 cents to $1 compared to a male. Black females, 67%. White females, 80% of a man's dollar, and Asian females, because of high education levels, 86%. Okay, so you can see where just your sex is associated with your life chances. And so European males did everything in their power to subjugate people in the lower classes, and that includes slavery, that includes Jim Crow laws, that includes denying rights of women, that includes encroaching on Native American lands, discrimination against Arabs, discrimination against Jewish people. So there's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to be talking about. But that's a big focus of this class, guys. It's all about social class and life chances. How much money you have and how that gives you power, for example. But then your access to money is associated with your sex and your race and your ethnicity and your religion, because institutional discrimination still exists. As we'll look at in Chapter 2, a white-sounding name gets a callback for a job 8 times more than a black-sounding name. And this is the dark sadness of the reality of society that we're going to be studying in this class. So again, I'm trying to set you up, give you guys a little bit of disclaimer that, a lot of it's dark when you look at social stratification and social class and inequality, all right? However, having a population majority doesn't mean that you are the dominant group in power, because currently there's more women in the United States than there are men. However, men still hold these elite social positions, and prejudice and discrimination against women still exists. Okay, so minority status is not always about numbers. The book talks about the characteristics of a minority. Again, when you think about minority, first, it's less power and control over their life. That's the easiest, most general way to say it, okay? But minorities experience unequal treatment, have less power, prejudice, discrimination, segregation, extermination, all methods that have been used to maintain the status quo of those in power to guarantee social inequality. Physical traits, such as, just traits that don't really make sense when it comes to biology, but your skin color, for example, they commonly share physical traits. Membership is not voluntary. You cannot choose your sex. I mean, you can choose your gender, and you can, I guess, choose your sex. That's not totally accurate to say that, obviously. But again, we're born into these groups. Okay, we're born into, you are this race, and you're told your whole life, you are this sex, and you're this gender, and this is how you're supposed to be, and these are the groups you belong to, and this is your religion, because it's always been that way. Okay, so membership and minority status is not always voluntary. Minority groups have this sense of group membership, and then marriage tends to remain within groups. So again, just think about how much race and prejudice and discrimination are associated with who you date. Interracial dating. Okay, so when you look at the studies of race and interracial dating, you guys will see that your lives are structured by these institutions like race. And then your race then affects the institutions like the family, which is a major structure of society, okay? So the types of racial groups types of minority groups, you have racial groups. Again, and what is a racial group we're going to be critiquing this all class, okay? Because it's a blend of nation of origin, biology, skin color, what kind of hair you have, just how tall you are. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. But when you guys start to look at race, you'll start to see that the definitions don't make sense at all. Then you have ethnic groups, and that's think about culture, a common way of life. Religious groups, people that follow a common ideology, of which culture ideology is an aspect of culture. Then you have your gender groups, so anyone between male and female along the continuum of gender. And then you have other forms of group stratification, like how is age associated with inequality, disability status, that's a big one, physical appearance, sexual identity. And all of these have little subsets that really get interesting. So, whatever you guys are interested in this class, you'll have an opportunity to pursue that. So if you're really interested in studying age and disability status, which I'm absolutely fascinated with, I love gerontology, it's one of my favorite studies, you can do that for your final project. So things to be thinking about, okay? So the most important thing I have to explain is this, probably for the entire class. And this is the idea that there's no biological basis for race, okay? Race is a social construction. We're the ones who made up like 3 or 4 categories. I think we're up to 5 now. And we try to group all of humanity under 5 categories. And there's no biological basis for it. There is no biological basis to say that all people that are black share common risk for heart disease. Okay, even in the medical community, they are quite aware. They're very aware. Look at Rodriguez et al. 2002-17. Even the medical community knows that race is crap, guys. Like, none of us are actually white or black, and why? How could you say that someone from India is Asian? Does someone from India look just like someone who's China, or someone who's from Japan, or someone who's from Mongolia, of which Russia is right there? Why are Russians not considered Asians? Why are Russians white? Okay, so we're going to be asking tons of questions, but the idea of the social construction of race is this: we made it up. Some people got together, some Europeans or whoever it was got together, and they decided that we're just going to call all Europeans white and all non-Europeans non-white, and then over time we'll make up a bunch of other categories like mestizo or mulatto. You guys don't know those words because you don't live in Latin America. But again, when I read the word mestizo, that was when I discovered I wasn't white, because it turns out mestizo is European mixed with Native American or Amerindian or whatever word you prefer to use. And so am I really a mestizo? Am I really white? So guys, white's not a race. White's an ethnicity. White's an ethnicity that crosses the whole planet, from Asia and Russia to Europe to North America to Australia to. Okay, so white is not a race. It's an ethnicity. Even the Supreme Government or the Supreme Court of the United States was very clear that white is not a race. It's an ethnicity, and it's not based upon biological traits. If you think you're white, you have more in common genetically than anyone in Africa right now. And if you don't believe me, go look at the literature. The literature is going to say there is more diversity within groups than there are between groups. Therefore, your DNA is more similar to an African than it is your next door neighbor, who also you might think is white. And again, that might upset you when you first think about it, because to have someone sitting here telling you you're not actually white or black, that's a hard thing to hear. But I'm saying look to the literature. Look at Orlando Patterson, a professor from Harvard, who's always talking about this. Look at the medical biology of race. Start looking into it. But that's what this class is for, guys. It's to introduce you to these ideas. Introduction to diversity. Okay? So again, I put on the bottom here, do you really think people from India and China are the same race? Because according to the United States, they are. Think about that. All right. So again, race is not a biological fact. There's no such thing as pure genetic types. There are no mutually exclusive biological races. We're all blended along a continuum. Okay? Skin tone varies among people from Africa and Asia and everywhere, and we're all blended within the races. There's like my son's got the Italian. How many times has Italian been conquered by North Africa? My wife's from Albania. I mean, it's right next to Greece. How many times did the Persians come over, and then Genghis Khan, and then, Hannibal with his elephants? Think about it. How many times have they mixed? So are Europeans mixed is one of my favorite questions, because if you look at National Geographic's take on Europeans, it says Europeans are nothing more than people from the Middle East and Africa and Russia. Because, that's what surrounds Europe, and they all went in there, right? And then blended. So again, how do we measure race? In the end, you'd probably need about 10,000 different races to be able to account for all the racial diversity of our genetics, okay? Because we're all been blended. The world is globalized. We've been blended for a very long time. And a lot of our discussions are going to talk about this, okay? The book talks about some fun stuff. Like if you looked at genetic resistance to malaria, then people from Norway all the way to Africa are one race, okay? I often talk about the Norwegian Africans because, again, they're all the same. They just kind of migrated. They're all the same people. It's just their skin color changed depending on the amount of sun they were exposed to. That's called epigenetics, the influence of the environment on your gene expression. Something you guys should look into. That's really cool. If you group people according to lactose intolerance, some Africans, Asians, and Southern Europeans, because they can't have milk, or they're intolerant to milk, okay, they would be the same race. But again, biologically, no pure races exist. That's the point of all of this, okay? Again, if you were white in America, you have more in common with someone in Africa. And again, intelligence is slightly influenced by genetics, more like just your parents. Most of intelligence is based upon the nurturing side, not the nature, okay? So anything you've heard about any aspect of like the bell curve, which was a big debate in the 90s, which was really negative and caused a lot of racial divides, for example. The number one important thing to development and your IQ level, how smart you are, guys, it turns out it's really like, socioeconomic status. It's about money and the neighborhood you grew up in and how you were raised. That's really what it's all about. The school you went to, that kind of stuff. All right? So, symbolic meaning of race in theory, okay? Why is race so important? Okay, because a lot of people, I'm not the only one, sitting here talking about how racial categories do not accurately group people according to biological traits, yet we're sticking with our race. So from a functionalist perspective, since we're in sociology, we'll work through the theories. From a functionalist perspective, race was constructed for a purpose. It was created so Europeans can make very clear who was supposed to be the working class, okay? That's why it was created. That's the whole purpose of it, okay? Conflict perspective looks at how dividing into races causes conflict between groups of people regarding segregation, inequality, all of those factors. Symbolic interactionism theory would say, look, guys, race and the meaning attached to these categories, we made them all up. If you don't like the categories because they're inaccurate, stop using them. Stop calling yourself white and black. Come up with something better, okay? Or change the meaning attached to race, like stop constructing negative stereotypes that influence attitudes toward prejudice and discrimination. Okay? All right, cool. So again, where does race come from? It came from Europeans wanting to divide the society into rich and poor, those who could have prejudice and access to prejudice, and those who could not. This didn't mean that all whites have prejudice. It means all whites have access to prejudice. Historically, if you were male, and now if you're female, okay? So when you look at privilege, that's the idea, is that not everyone has privilege, but if you're white, it gives you better access to privilege, which is bad for everyone because that means we're restricting like all these Einsteins from being able to participate in society. We restricted women, half the population, for all of human history. Think about that. How many more Einsteins could we have had if we just let a girl go and do science? Something to think about, okay? So racism is this idea that one race is superior to another. Again, it just justified the social class positions of the rich versus poor in the United States, okay? So races came about as we created races, then decided and made the criteria for who's in which race, and then we enforced policies on a social and institutional level that made sure, depending on what race you are, determines what social class you're in, okay? So we're in sociology. So again, sociology, we're studying society. A society is a group of people that share something in common. A culture is a group of people that share common lifestyles. These are all things that we're going to be looking at in this class. We're studying society. We're looking at what groups of people have in common. We're questioning what they have in common. We're looking at how culture and segregation influences our attitudes, behaviors, our general way of life, okay? So in sociology, we're going to be talking about all of the human sciences. I'm going to be talking about economics and political science and biology and philosophy and psychology because I need all of these answers to be able to explain why things work. Again, because I'm saying the origin of race is economics. And that might seem odd to you at first, but then think about it for a little bit. Okay? The goal of capitalism is to reduce competition. So if you segregate and remove and have prejudice and discrimination against women and minorities, then who can actually compete with the European males? And that's the way it was for centuries. Okay? So we're going to be looking through the lens of race, social class, gender, religion, age, culture, all of these different variables, and then relying on the other social sciences along with sociology to really interpret how society works, okay? How do groups of people function? How does it operate, okay? So social stratification is a big word. This is the way we divide into groups based upon an arbitrary system, and then these groups can be ranked, okay? So again, dividing into people with property, people that don't, upper and lower class, who's located where, dividing in who has more power in the United States historically, someone who's white or non-white, who has more power in the United States historically, someone who was Christian or non-Christian, who has more power in society in America historically, someone who is male or female. So these are the ways we divide into groups. And then when we talk about intersectionality, you're going to be looking at how do you combine all of these variables to understand the experience of a person, like a black female, for example, who may experience life very differently than a white female because a white female only experiences sexism, whereas a black female experiences both racism and sexism, okay? So a social class system is based upon your amount of wealth, power, prestige, and education, compounded with other variables such as your culture and habitus, ways of life, the food you eat, your ideology, things like that. Socioeconomic status simply measures where you are in the class system based upon all of those factors. So if you did a math equation of the groups that you belong to and whether or not that group has power or not, and then you put it all together, then you can figure out where you're located in society. And people do this. They do statistical diagrams and beautiful graphs and pictures to show you where everybody's located compared to everybody else, okay? And commonly, whatever social class you're born into, people tend to stay in those social classes, and that's something called class reproduction. Okay, and that's why this class is really important, because we need to make sure that people that have historically been minorities have access. Society should be full of equity, where everyone has equal access to compete, okay? That is how you make meritocracy happen. Okay, so again, your access to education, wealth, jobs, power, all of this, okay? This is what determines your life chances, okay? So it's all about gaining access. So European males, what did they do? They denied access. I mean, it wasn't until the civil rights movement and 3 waves of feminism movement that you're finally getting minority status. With some minorities, people that identify as minority status are finally getting some power over their own lives. Okay, I mean, so again, in the bottom, yay for civil rights, because I have a daughter. Trust me, I do not want her to experience prejudice and discrimination, and I'm sad that she's going to hear all the negative stereotypes in life, okay? Because those stereotypes then influence my daughter's access to rise up the social class ladder to get more life chances, okay? So again, theories of race, you got functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and labeling theory. How are groups labeled and how does that affect people? This is what you need to be thinking about the whole time. How do you think about these theories, And how do you apply them? So we'll be talking about them. So the effects of stereotypes. Stereotypes, again, are stigmas, and these stigmas can affect people in incredible ways, not only by denying their access, but I want you guys to be thinking about the psychology of stereotypes. How does it affect the way you think, the way you behave, the way you feel? When you look out and you say, how does society view me? What do you see reflected back, okay? Because yourself is influenced by how you think other people feel about you. Okay, so the book talks about migration, annexation, colonialism, all these different ways that subordinate groups were created. We are going to be talking a lot about immigration in this class, and some interesting things like why are there negative stereotypes on immigration when immigration is like the #1 factor that improves an economy really fast. We'll talk a little bit about that later. I won't get into it too much now, okay? But again, How does people can become subordinate status? We're going to be looking at all the different groups. We're going to be looking at African Americans and Arab Americans, Jewish Americans, women, all these uh, great perspectives, so we can kind of get a feel for how they became minorities and how do we improve their life to help them get more power and control over their lives. Okay, we did talk a little bit about colonialism, but again, colonialism is just the idea of Europeans going into different countries, imposing themselves as the upper class, and then subjugating all the other people into the lower classes. Okay, and then depending upon your race, your sex, your religion, etc., this influenced whether or not you could compete. Okay, it's not a thing in the past. The book does talks about the the world systems theory, and the world systems theory is all about the way the world looked during colonialism with North America and Europeans, kind of on top. It still looks like that. And so I want you guys to be thinking about globalization and then look at the global economy and then which countries are positioned where. For example, in America, the average American makes 55,000, the average person in China makes 7. Who has more life chances? So just based upon the country you're born into also influences your life chances. Okay? It's a diverse topic with a lot of moving parts. Okay? So again, we are globally connected. The world is a global economic system, and the world systems theory basically just says that the people that held power during colonialism plus the United States still have power, okay? And you can look at it as the world as one big giant class system, and where you're located in that system compared to other people is based upon education, job, wealth, power, and all the other factors that we're going to be talking about, okay? The dark side that your book starts talking about, when we looked at history of racial relations, a lot of it's bad. Dark, sad stuff that'll break you, such as extermination, like genocide and ethnic cleansing, which you can argue, of course, Germany with the Holocaust. Did the Americans commit genocide over the natives? It's just a question. Because look, guys, again, a lot of England was conquered a lot. Then Romans came over. How many different people have gone over to England and tried to conquer? So when England came over and conquered the United States, did England look at it as genocide? However, was it genocide? Because 95% of Native Americans died. So again, we got to look at things from all these different ways, guys, and ask a ton of questions, okay? But again, this, Jewish discrimination has happened everywhere. Also in England in the 800s and things like that. So when you get into history, it runs deep, okay? We'll talk about that more in that chapter. Expulsion, people have been kicked out, people have seceded, you have segregation between groups like we historically had in the United States with the white and non-white bathrooms, which is really sad. We'll look at some of that in the 1950s, and then apartheid like in South Africa. Okay, so the history of racial interaction and segregation has not always been beautiful. For example, in the United States, when we tried to integrate the schools, you had the white flight because people that were white didn't want to go to school with minorities. And so they all moved out to the suburbs. So the school systems in the inner cities went kind of bad for a while. And the suburb schools got really good. But now all of a sudden everyone's moving back into the city, and everyone's starting to blend. Is America a melting pot, or is it more like oil and water based upon segregation? I want you guys thinking about things like that. Think about how race influences your marriage patterns. Again, just, look at the marriage patterns. It was only 650,000 pre-1980 interracial marriages. Since we've reduced our attitudes toward discrimination and prejudice, we're at 5.4 million in 2010, and it's just going up, which is awesome to see. That's, again, positive stuff right there. Okay, when cultures come over in America, were they able to maintain their culture, or do they kind of lose it? So this is the idea of assimilation, where a culture gets assimilated into a larger group, and then pluralism is this idea of having multiple groups and everyone kind of coexisting together, okay? Resistance and change, this is going to be something we're going to be looking at. Again, looking at all the different social movements, changes in attitudes, is the world more equitable than it was? If someone is gay, they can get married. That's amazing. Okay, so huge strides have come along. Okay, so again, there's some positive stuff that comes out of this, but again, the dark side of why there had to be a social movement in the first place, That's the dark side, okay? And then again, intersectionality is this idea of combining all of these variables, all of these diverse groups that you belong to that influence your experience, put them all together and figure out how it all operates, okay? And so that's the idea of who has more life chances, someone who's a white female or a black female. Well, a white female, because of the white. And that's the stuff that sucks. And that's the stuff that we need to be talking about in this class, okay? And so intersectionality, if you guys get a chance to look at that, I will, I think I actually maybe posted the article. Yeah, it's probably posted. But if you get a chance, that's Crenshaw, 1989, and that's law. It's, Crenshaw's writing in a law review, and a law review then just gets adopted by all the social sciences because looking at the world through an intersectional way. Like in theater, how, you want to make a light green, you put a green over it. If you want to make it a different color, like a purple, you put a red and a green or something. So if you're like a white female, you only have one filter through your life. But if you're a black female, you have two. Okay? And then if you're a black female who identifies as Muslim, you have three. Okay? And so this is intersectionality. It's deep. It's fun stuff. Okay? Again, there are different points of view on race. Booker T. Washington argued for races being apart. Du Bois encouraged African Americans to assimilate into society, okay? And so you have this big debate. Is life fair? Should we get along? Why don't we get along? Why is there so much hate? Why do hate crimes happen? Okay, we're going to talk about all of this stuff, okay? But again, this idea of unity, you can be unified and diverse. You can be unified even having different opinions. America is unified even though we have split political parties. The best thing about America is, in the end, we have all these divergent opinions, and so we don't have tyranny. And again, diversity is great for all kinds of things. Okay, so just stuff to be thinking about. Hope you all enjoy this class. If there's anything special, please email. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.